Amalickiahs' invasion. Background. The wars recorded in the book of Alma involved two nations, the Nephites and the Lamanites. The Lamanites occupied both the east and west coasts. The Lamanites were spread through the wilderness on the west, bordering along by the seashore. And also there were many Lamanites on the east by the seashore. From these lands they launched repeated attacks, led by Amalickiah. The Nephite defenders were led by Captain Moroni. Unfortunately, wars never did cease for the space of many years with the Lamanites. To consolidate Nephite territory, Captain Moroni dispossessed the Lamanites who lived on the east coast. Moroni caused that his army should go forth into the east wilderness, yea, and they went forth and drove all the Lamanites who were in the east wilderness into their own lands, which were south of the land of Zarahemla. And the land of Nephi did run in a straight course from the east sea to the west. And thus he cut off all the strongholds of the Lamanites in the east wilderness, yea, and also on the west, fortifying the line between the Nephites and the Lamanites. Nephite settlers quickly occupied the east coast. Moroni caused that the inhabitants who were in the land of Zarahemla and in the land round about should go forth into the east wilderness, even to the borders by the seashore, and possess the land. The Nephites lost no time building cities in the newly occupied territory. And it came to pass that the Nephites began the foundation of a city Moroni, and it was by the east sea. And they also began a foundation for a city Nephiah, and they also began to build many cities on the north, one which they called Lehi, which was by the borders of the seashore. Though the scriptures don't explicitly state it, it seems reasonable to suppose that this displacement gave Amalickiah a pretext to rally the Lamanite armies. They wanted to recover the lands from which they and their families had been driven. 2,000 years later, the nation of Israel faced similar backlash after expelling a hostile Palestinian population. Whatever the motive, Amalickiah now launched another and far more successful invasion. Phase 1. East Coast Campaign. Amalickiah invades northward up the east coast. In about 66 BC, Amalickiah's invasion began with an attack on the city Moroni. While Moroni was thus breaking down the wars and contentions among his own people and subjecting them to peace and civilization and making regulations to prepare for war against the Lamanites, behold, the Lamanites had come into the land of Moroni. Refugees from Moroni fled to Nephi, where they were safe for the moment. Amalickiah would not suffer the Lamanites to go against the city of Nephi to battle, but kept them down by the seashore. Nevertheless, Alma lists Nephi as a city eventually taken by the Lamanite armies. The Lamanite armies marched up the coast, taking each city in turn. And thus he, Amalickiah, went on taking possession of many cities, the city of Nephi, and the city of Lehi, and the city of Morianton, and the city of Omner, and the city of Gid, and the city of Mulek, all of which were on the east borders by the seashore. Amalickiah was finally stalked by Teancum. Amalickiah was marching forth with his numerous army that he might take possession of the land Bountiful, and also the land northward. But behold, he met with a disappointment by being repulsed by Teancum and his men, for they were great warriors. While both armies were in the field, Teancum went out by night and went into the camp of Amalickiah. Teancum stole privily into the tent of the king and put a javelin to his heart. Upon learning of Amalickiah's death, the demoralized Lamanite armies abandoned their design in marching into the land northward and retreated with all their army into the city of Mulek and sought protection in their fortifications. Phase 2. West Coast Campaign. At the same time Amalickiah is devastating the east coast, other Lamanite armies are marching up the west coast. The Lamanites had waged a similar campaign on the west coast. Helaman writes, "These are the cities of which the Lamanites have obtained possession by the shedding of the blood of so many of our valiant men: Manti, Zeezrom, Cumeni, and Antipara. And these are the cities which they possessed when I arrived at the city of Judea." Phase 3. We will put an end to this great iniquity. The Nephites, led by Captain Moroni, take the offensive to recapture their territory. Captain Moroni set about recapturing the territory lost to Amalickiah. Moroni lured the Lamanites into attacking a small decoy army that he marched near Mulek. While the Lamanites pursued the Nephite decoys northward, Moroni recaptured the lightly defended city, then marched north to engage the larger Lamanite force. Caught between Moroni's army and a northern army led by Lehi, the Lamanite force was defeated. The Lamanites held Nephite prisoners in the city Gid. Moroni sent a small group of men posing as escaped prisoners who had stolen wine to Gid. The guards drank the wine, and while they were in a drunken sleep, Moroni armed the Nephite prisoners and surrounded the city with his army. When the Lamanites awoke, they found themselves facing an army without and armed prisoners within. They surrendered. On the west coast, Helaman held the city of Judea. The Lamanites holding Antipara were too strong to attack. Helaman lured the Lamanites out of Antipara by marching his young troops past the city. The Lamanites gave chase and were in turn pursued by Antipas and his army. The Nephites surrounded and defeated the Lamanite army. Soon after, the Lamanites abandoned Antipara. After a brief siege, the Lamanites yielded up the city Cumeni into our hands. A Lamanite attempt to retake Cumeni was thwarted, and the Lamanites were driven back to the city of Manti. Bypassing Zeezrom, Helaman set his sights on Manti. Luring the Lamanite army out into the field, he had a small hidden force take the city. After this loss, the armies of the Lamanites did flee out of all this quarter of the land. Helaman writes, "And those cities which had been taken by the Lamanites, all of them are at this period of time in our possession." The Lamanite armies that Helaman had driven out of the west coast joined the Lamanites on the east coast. They attacked and took Nephia, which harbored Nephite refugees from Moroni, Lehi, and Morianton. This move caught Moroni by surprise. His anger at the government's failure to support the war effort boiled over. Moroni's complaint to Pahoran. Moroni wrote an angry letter to Pahoran, the chief judge, demanding reinforcements and supplies, and threatening to turn his armies on the government should they fail to comply. Pahoran's response. Pahoran sympathized with Moroni's frustration. He explained that the kingman had driven Pahoran into exile in the land of Gideon, cut off support for the military, appointed a king, offered to surrender the Nephites if the Lamanites would establish the king selected by the kingmen. Pahoran encouraged Moroni to use military force to destroy the false government. Moroni crushes the rebellion. Moroni marched to Gideon, gathering strength along the way from patriots joining his cause. Uniting his forces with those of Pahoran, they marched together against Pachus, the rebel king, in Zarahemla. Pachus was slain and his army defeated. Any rebels who would not take up arms were executed. Having secured Zarahemla, Moroni immediately sent troops and supplies to Helaman in the west and to Lehi and Teancum in the east. Pahoran and Moroni marched toward Nephia, engaging and defeating a Lamanite army en route. Moroni snuck an armed force into the western part of Nephia, while the Lamanites camped on the east by the city's entrance. The Lamanite army fled to Moroni. Moroni went forth from the land of Nephia to the land of Lehi, and when the Lamanites saw that Moroni was coming against them, they were again frightened and fled before the army of Moroni. And it came to pass that Moroni and his army did pursue them from city to city, until they were met by Lehi and Teancum. Trapped between the two armies, the Lamanites fled from Lehi and Teancum, even down upon the borders by the seashore, until they came to the land of Moroni. Blaming Ammoron and his brother Amalickiah for all this conflict, Teancum in his anger did go forth into the camp of the Lamanites, and did find the king. And he did cast a javelin at him, which did pierce him near the heart. But behold, the king did awaken his servants before he died, insomuch that they did pursue Teancum and slew him. Moroni drove the remaining Lamanites out of the land. Conclusion. What lessons can we learn from this long and costly war? The campaign to recover Nephite cities lost to Amalickiahs' invasion consumed 6 years and countless lives. Lesson learned? To paraphrase Alma, it was easier to keep the nation from falling into the hands of the Lamanites than to retake it from them. Lessons applied. How do the Nephites' struggles to defend and recover their land apply to us in our daily lives?